What if the most famous building on the planet was never built by the man history gives credit to? What if the single piece of evidence connecting a pharaoh to the Great Pyramid was scribbled in the dark by a man who desperately needed a discovery, and nobody was there to watch him do it? For nearly 2 centuries, that question has sat quietly inside one of the most visited monuments on Earth, and one outspoken researcher has spent 30 years refusing to let it go. His name is Graham Hancock, and he is not an archaeologist. He holds no university post, no excavation permit, no seat on any academic board. He is a former journalist who spent years working in serious financial and political reporting, the kind of work that trains a person to distrust a clean story and to ask who benefits when history gets told a certain way. In the early 1990s he turned that instinct away from newsrooms and toward ruins, and he never really stopped. Since then he has traveled to Egypt, to the highlands of Indonesia, to submerged rock formations off the coast of Japan, and to the jungle pyramids of Central America, collecting a pattern he believes connects them all: the idea that an advanced culture existed long before the ones we credit with civilization's beginning, and that its survivors seeded knowledge into the societies that came after. Mainstream Egyptologists reject this idea almost entirely, and they are not shy about it. Hancock's theories are widely dismissed as pseudo-archaeology, criticized for cherry-picking evidence, ignoring the wealth of documented Old Kingdom construction records, and building conclusions first before hunting for facts to support them afterward. That criticism deserves to be said plainly, because Hancock's claims are not accepted by the scientific community that studies Egypt professionally. But before dismissing the man entirely, it is worth understanding exactly what he points to, because some of the questions he raises are stranger than they first appear, even to people who ultimately disagree with his conclusions. Start with the silence inside the pyramid itself. Ancient Egyptians were an intensely decorative civilization. They covered tomb walls, coffins, temple columns, and even the undersides of ceilings with hieroglyphs, painted scenes, prayers, and the names of the dead, because they believed that writing a name preserved a soul. Walk into the king's chamber at the heart of the Great Pyramid, though, and you find almost nothing. No hieroglyphs. No painted scenes of the afterlife. No funerary texts. Just bare stone walls and a plain, unmarked granite box that most people call a sarcophagus. When that chamber was first opened in recorded history, the box held no body, no jewelry, no preserved organs, no burial goods of any kind, nothing that appears in essentially every other royal Egyptian tomb ever found. For a culture that could not leave a wall blank, Hancock argues that silence is strange, and he is far from alone in noticing it. Even researchers, who fully accept the traditional timeline, have puzzled over the pyramid's near-total lack of interior inscription. So if the chamber itself says nothing, where does the connection to Khufu, the pharaoh credited with commissioning the Great Pyramid, actually come from? The answer traces back to a single event in 1837. A British adventurer and engineer named Colonel Howard Vyse was excavating the pyramid on a tight budget, and an even tighter timeline, using gunpowder, to blast his way into a series of cramped, low chambers stacked above the king's chamber, spaces that had likely gone untouched for thousands of years. Inside those chambers, painted in red ochre, he reported finding quarry marks, the kind of working notations ancient Labors left behind, and among them, a royal cartouche that was read as the name of Khufu. That discovery became the entire foundation for attributing the Great Pyramid to Khufu. It remains, to this day, essentially the only direct physical link between that specific pharaoh and that specific monument. Hancock does not claim to have proof that Vyse forged the marks. He is careful to say that outright. What he raises instead are the circumstances surrounding the discovery: a man under financial and professional pressure, working largely without independent witnesses, in sealed chambers he alone controlled access to, who then reported finding the exact piece of evidence that would validate his entire expedition. Some researchers who have examined the marks over the years have also pointed to oddities in the hieroglyphic style, spellings and forms that strike them as inconsistent with the period, though Egyptologists, who have studied the same marks in detail have generally concluded they are authentic period writing and consistent with known scribal practices of the era. This is a genuinely contested point, and reasonable, qualified people land on different sides of it. Hancock then pushes the question a layer deeper, and this is where his argument becomes more of a thought experiment than a factual claim. Even if the marks are entirely genuine, he asks, does a painted name prove that Khufu's workers built the pyramid from nothing, or could it simply prove that they were present, restoring, repairing, or sealing a structure that already existed? Ancient Egyptians were prolific recyclers of earlier monuments. Later pharaohs routinely carved their names over the cartouches of predecessors, claimed older temples and obelisks as their own, and treated the reuse of ancient structures as an act of legitimacy rather than deception. Hancock's suggestion, and it remains speculative rather than demonstrated, is that Khufu may have inherited an already ancient monument rather than commissioned a new one, which would also explain why the interior is so uncharacteristically bare of the boastful inscriptions found in every other pharaoh's tomb. The established archaeological record argues strongly against this idea. Excavated workers' villages near Giza, administrative papyri describing pyramid construction logistics, and quarry marks throughout the broader pyramid complex all point toward a well-organized, well-documented Old Kingdom building project carried out over multiple generations of the same dynasty. Radiocarbon dating of organic material embedded in the mortar has also produced dates broadly consistent with the traditional 4th dynasty timeline, though Hancock and other skeptics note that such samples can be affected by older reused material and argue the dating evidence is not as airtight as often presented. This remains one of the more genuinely debated technical points between mainstream Egyptology and its critics. From here, Hancock shifts his argument away from names and toward the stone itself, because unlike ink in a hidden chamber, 13 acres of solid rock cannot be quietly forged. The Great Pyramid is oriented to true north with an accuracy of a small fraction of 1 degree, a level of precision that still challenges modern surveying equipment. Its base, spanning 13 acres of open desert, is level to within a fraction of an inch from corner to corner. In many places along the interior passages, the stone blocks are fitted so tightly that even a thin blade cannot slide into the seam between them, despite some of those blocks weighing several tons apiece. Hancock treats these details as physical evidence that deserves an explanation independent of who gets credited with the project, and he argues that the tools traditionally described, copper chisels, wooden sledges, ropes, and ramps, sit uncomfortably far from the precision actually measured on site. Engineers and Egyptologists who study ancient construction methods have offered detailed responses to nearly all of these points. Experimental archaeology projects have demonstrated that copper tools, when properly heat-treated and used correctly, are capable of working limestone and even granite far more effectively than is commonly assumed. Studies of true north alignment techniques suggest ancient astronomers could have achieved that level of precision using simple methods involving the observed positions of stars, and computer models of various ramp systems, straight ramps, spiraling ramps, and internal ramps have each been proposed as physically plausible solutions. Even though no single ramp theory has definitively explained every stage of construction, and no large-scale ramp remains have been conclusively identified at the site. That gap, the fact that no obvious physical trace of a construction ramp has survived, is one of the strongest points skeptics like Hancock continue to raise, and it remains a live area of research and debate rather than a fully settled question. Then there is the arithmetic that Hancock leans on most heavily. The Great Pyramid contains somewhere around 2 million stone blocks. Divide that number across the roughly 20 years the traditional timeline allows for construction, and account for realistic working hours, and you arrive at a rough pace of one block being quarried, transported, and precisely set roughly every few minutes, for 2 decades, without major error. Hancock presents that pace as implausible. Mainstream researchers counter that a workforce numbering in the tens of thousands, organized into rotating, specialized crews working multiple points of the structure simultaneously, could realistically sustain that pace, particularly for the many smaller, more easily handled blocks that make up the bulk of the structure's volume, with the far larger granite blocks reserved for a much smaller number of specific interior locations. This is, again, a point where credentialed engineers and archaeologists have done detailed load calculations and arrived at conclusions that directly contradict Hancock's presentation of the numbers. The granite is its own separate puzzle. The king's chamber is lined with granite rather than the local limestone that makes up most of the pyramid, and some of its ceiling beams are estimated to weigh in the range of tens of tons each. That granite did not come from Giza. It was quarried at Aswan, several hundred miles to the south, and transported down the Nile before being hauled and raised into position. Hancock treats the sheer difficulty of that logistical chain as further evidence that something about the traditional account does not add up. Egyptologists point to well-documented ancient granite quarrying techniques, including the use of dolerite pounding stones and wooden wedges soaked with water to split stone along natural fracture lines, along with river transport methods that are independently attested in ancient Egyptian texts and depicted in period artwork, as a coherent, if still logistically demanding, explanation. What makes Hancock's version of this argument distinct from more extreme fringe claims is what he explicitly does not say. He does not argue that aliens or a lost technologically advanced supercivilization used laser tools or anti-gravity. His actual claim, stated carefully in his own writing and interviews, is narrower, that a sophisticated seafaring culture existed earlier than currently accepted, was largely wiped out by a global cataclysm at the end of the last ice age, and that scattered survivors passed fragments of astronomical and engineering knowledge into the cultures that followed, potentially including the very early stages of Egyptian civilization. It is still a claim well outside what the archaeological record currently supports, and the vast majority of specialists in the relevant fields, from geology to archaeology to Egyptology, do not find the physical evidence for it convincing. No confirmed archaeological site, tool assemblage, or settlement from such an advanced pre-Ice Age culture has ever been found, and that absence matters a great deal to the scientists evaluating the claim. So where does that leave the actual pyramid? The honest answer is that the overwhelming weight of physical, textual, and archaeological evidence still supports the conventional account, that the Great Pyramid was built during the reign of Khufu in the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, roughly 4,500 years ago, by a large, well-organized Egyptian workforce using tools, ramps, and techniques that continue to be studied, tested, and refined by modern researchers. Hancock's contribution, whatever you think of his broader theories, has been to keep certain uncomfortable questions in public view: the strange bareness of the king's chamber, the suspicious circumstances surrounding the 1837 discovery of Khufu's name, and the genuine engineering difficulty of the pyramid's precision at that scale. Those are real, documented oddities, even if the conclusions Hancock draws from them go far beyond what most experts believe the evidence can support. Perhaps the more interesting story here is not about ancient Egypt at all, but about how a civilization's history gets written and rewritten over time, and how much weight we place on a handful of red paint marks discovered under circumstances nobody today can fully verify. Whether you side with the archaeologists who have spent careers excavating, dating, and documenting the Giza Plateau, or find yourself drawn to Hancock's instinct to keep pulling at the loose threads, the pyramid itself is not going anywhere. It has stood through 5,000 years of shifting empires, shifting religions, and shifting scholarship, silently waiting for someone to finally settle the argument for good. So here is the question worth sitting with. Of everything laid out here, the missing inscriptions, the suspicious discovery of Khufu's name, the physical precision of the stonework, or the sheer scale of the construction timeline, which detail do you find hardest to explain away? Do you think the evidence still points where the textbooks say it does? Or do you think there's a piece of this story we have not been told? Leave your answer in the comments, and if you want more deep dives into the mysteries still hiding in plain sight across the ancient world, make sure you are subscribed for what comes next.